Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. We're out here today in my driveway on this rare, sunny, fairly warm winter day because we have kind of a messy project today. So I've been waiting for a warmish day so that we could get this done outside. I have done this project in the house in the past and it involves a lot of cleanup. So, definitely better to do it outside when possible. Today we're going to be mixing up some potting mix. It is almost time for seed starting. And one of the things that I need to check off the list, one of the tasks I need to get done before we can actually start seeds, is to get my season's batch of potting mix mixed up. So this isn't going to be an exact recipe. If you've been around for a little while, then if you've been hanging out with me for a while, you know that I generally don't do things by exact recipes. So we're just going to be kind of making this by feel, but I'll share with you the ingredients that I'm going to be putting in this potting soil, why I chose the ingredients that I did, and then we will mix it up and be one step closer to starting seeds for the year. So I like to use as the base of my potting mix coconut coir. So this is basically fiber from coconuts. So I have here an 11-pound bag. So this is a bulk amount of cocoa coir. So you can definitely buy this in smaller amounts. It'd be probably a little bit easier to work with, definitely less of a big project than what we're going to do today. But I go through a lot of potting mix as the season goes on, so I like to purchase a big block of this in bulk. Now, this isn't any kind of fancy brand or anything like that. This is just what I was able to get from Home Depot. So any kind of brand that that has good reviews, I would say give that a try. So this is obviously dehydrated. It's a big solid block right now. So the first thing that I need to do is take this in my house. I'm going to rehydrate it inside, and then I'll come back out here and we'll mix everything out here. Now, if it was warmer, if I was doing this in summer, I would probably rehydrate it outside just using water from my hose. It'd be a little bit easier. But it is, even though it's fairly warm today, it's still winter. So I want to do this in my house with hot water, or with warm water, I should say. I find that the cocoa fiber absorbs warm water really well. So I'm just going to go ahead and rehydrate my cocoa coir in this bin here. You can see I've got a little bit of residue of last year's potting mix. So we're going to give this a little bit of a wash and then rehydrate the cocoa fiber in here. So this will come pretty close to filling this up. So once I get it rehydrated in here, I'm going to transfer about half of it into this bin here, and we'll mix our potting mix up in here, and I'll keep the other rehydrated cocoa fiber in here because we will need that again later this season. So I'm just going to rehydrate my cocoa fiber and get half of it transferred in here, and I will meet you back here when it's time to mix up our soil. So friends, it is actually now a couple days later. I rehydrated all the cocoa fiber. I have it here in this bin. I'll show you in a minute. And then I came outside to film this video with you and realized that I was actually missing one of the key ingredients of my potting mix. I thought that I had some on hand, but it turned out that I didn't. So by the time I was able to get to the store and get some, we got it, and it is now freezing and windy and horrible outside. So we missed our one day to do this outside. So we're doing the next best thing, and we're going to mix this in the garage today. So first, before we get mixing, I want to show you how this cocoa fiber rehydrated. So I rehydrated that whole block. You can see that it's nice and fluffy and really fine. So this will be really good for growing both seedlings in and older plants as well. So now that we finally have all our ingredients on hand, I want to just go through the different ingredients I'm going to be using in this potting mix, talk about why I chose each of these to use. And one thing I realized I actually probably should have addressed at the beginning of this video is why we are making potting mix and not using seed starting mix to start our seedlings. So really, to answer that question, the first thing that we need to talk about is the differences between potting mix and seed starting mix. Now, the primary differences, there's two major differences, which is, for one, seed starting mix tends to be a little bit finer. Potting mix, sometimes, especially if you buy commercially prepared potting mix, tends to have some larger pieces in it because it isn't made for starting seeds. It's made for larger plants with stronger roots that can handle a little bit less fine of a mix. Seedlings really do need a finer mix. So that is one of the main differences between commercial potting mix and commercial seed starting mix. The other primary difference is that Potting mix generally incorporates some sort of fertilizer or nutrients or something like that to help the plants grow, to give them the nutrients that they need, where seed starting mix generally does not include that. The reason for that is when you first start seedlings, the seed itself contains a certain amount of nutrients, basically the nutrients that that seed needs to germinate and to grow for the first little bit of time of its life. Now, the idea with seed starting mix is that you are going to start your seeds in that mix. It's really fine. It helps them grow. And then the idea is that you're going to transplant them into another container containing potting mix, which does have some sort of fertilizer in it, by the time that they have exhausted all the nutrients that come in the seed and by the time they need that additional nutrition. The other option is to keep them in the seed starting mix and to regularly fertilize them. So those are the primary differences. So what I'm making here, I'm calling potting mix, but it really has some of the advantages of seed starting mix as well. You know, I showed you how fine and fluffy this cocoa core is. This is fine enough to qualify as seed starting mix, but I'm calling it potting mix because we are going to incorporate some nutrients and fertilizer into this as well. The reason is that I don't want to have to transplant my seedlings at a certain point. You know, depending on what kind of container I am starting them in, I may need to just to accommodate their larger size, but I want to start them off with some nutrients right from the beginning. So that is one thing we're going to incorporate into this potting mix. So hopefully that makes sense as to why you would choose potting mix or why you would choose seed starting mix to start seedlings or to grow plants in. So now that we have covered that, let's get into the different ingredients that I'm going to be including in this potting mix that we are making. So the first ingredient is, of course, this cocoa fiber that we've already talked about. So I've rehydrated this, and this is going to be the base, the primary component in our seed starting mix. So most of the bulk of the seed starting mix will be made up of this, and I'll be adding other ingredients just to perform other tasks. So probably the two most common ingredients that you'll find as the base of a potting mix are cocoa core, like we have here, and the other option would be peat moss. Now, there are a couple reasons why I prefer to use cocoa fiber as opposed to peat moss. Peat moss is certainly a viable option, and if that's what you have on hand, that can work really well too. There are two main reasons why I choose to use the cocoa core. The first is that this is it's more of a sustainable resource. You know, peat moss, when it's harvested, there's a little bit more of a limited supply of it, where cocoa fiber is easily renewable. So it's a little bit better, it's a little more environmentally friendly to use the cocoa core. The other primary reason that I like to use cocoa core as opposed to peat moss is that cocoa fiber has a roughly neutral pH, where peat moss tends to be acidic, and too much acidity can be damaging to plants. So if you're using peat moss, sometimes, depending on how acidic it is, you may need to add another ingredient to kind of counteract the acidity. I would rather just stick with a neutral pH, and because cocoa fiber is more neutral, that's another great reason why I chose that. So the next ingredient that we're going to add in is this perlite here. Now you can see, you've probably seen this in prepared potting mix. It kind of looks like little styrofoam balls, but it is not actually styrofoam. This is actually, I don't know the chemical composition of it, but it is some type of mineral. The reason that I like to include perlite in my potting mix is because it allows the soil to aerate, it provides for better drainage. You really don't want plants that you're growing in pots to become, or plants in general, but for our purposes, plants in pots. You don't want them to become waterlogged. You don't want to have drainage issues. That can lead to root rot. It can lead to all kinds of plant diseases, things that you don't want your plants to have. So we want to make sure that we do have good drainage in our soil. So I'm going to add a fair amount of perlite to this mix. As I said in the beginning, I'm not going to measure anything. I don't really have proportions to share with you, but I'll just show you what I do. And sorry, I don't know if you can hear that weird noise in the background. That is my cat sneezing. Milo, you may have noticed, my black and white cat Milo has not been in a lot of videos lately. That's because after several instances getting into fights with neighbor cats, we've decided it's time to make him an indoor cat. So he's been banished to the house, but he does like to come into the garage with me sometimes. That's as close as he gets to the outside. So anyway, he's in the background sneezing. So if you hear a strange noise, that's what that is. So I have this organic perlite here. As I said, I'm not really going to measure. I'm just going to pour it into my mix until it seems like the right amount to me. I just kind of do this by feel. Because I make large batches of this, I don't really like to take the time to measure. I just kind of go by feel, and it's always worked well for me. So I'm just gonna go ahead and I'll probably use most of this bag here. Now you can see this is a little bit dusty. This is actually one of the reasons I prefer to do this outside. So I do recommend to mix something like this in a well-ventilated area if you can. My garage is pretty open, so it's not going to be that bad. I am going to be kind of holding my breath while I mix this to try to avoid breathing in as much of that dust as possible. If you are unable to do this in a well-ventilated area, it might be good to wear a mask to keep the dust out of your respiratory system. I don't have one on hand, so I'm just gonna hold my breath, but I figured I would just give you that little disclaimer. So we'll start with about this much. There's a little bit left in the bag, which I'll add in if I feel like it needs more. So the next ingredient that I'm going to add to this mix is vermiculite. Now, some people may think that you don't necessarily need both of these, perlite and vermiculite. I like to use both, but it is not a requirement. There have been years when I have not been able to find vermiculite. It's been out of stock everywhere, and I've only used perlite, and it's worked perfectly well that way too. So if you don't have access to vermiculite, just using perlite is fine. I do like to use the vermiculite when I have it because it is a little bit different than the perlite. Let me pull out a little bit to show you here. So you can see it looks different. It's brown. It's a little bit of a different type of mineral. They serve different purposes in the potting mix. So the perlite I mentioned is really good for promoting aeration in the soil and promoting drainage. The vermiculite also helps too. The vermiculite helps to make sure that the water doesn't drain too much. Not necessarily that it doesn't drain too much, but it allows the soil to hold on to the appropriate level of moisture. Vermiculite is also really good at helping soil to hold on to nutrients. So I really do like to use both of those. That may not be as much of an issue with starting my seedlings inside where they're going to be babied, and I'm going to take pretty good care of them. But I'm also going to be using the same potting mix for plants that will be growing out on my deck, and I want to make sure that that soil can hold on to the nutrients as much as possible. So I'll be using vermiculite as well, probably close to the same amount of perlite. Again, I don't really measure, but we'll pour this in and see if it looks right. So there you can see the contrast between the perlite and the vermiculite. They're pretty different in colors. And actually, once the soil is mixed, sometimes the vermiculite will kind of blend in and you won't even really be able to see it that much. So that looks about right to me. So the next ingredient, and this is what I was out of the other day, and this is why I was not able to make this video outside as I planned, is worm castings. Now, this is going to provide some gentle nutrients, which will be really good for the seedlings. You can see it has a little bit of nitrogen, has a little bit of nutrients in it, but it's not going to be really strong. I find that it tends to round out the blend really well. This is another ingredient. You don't technically need it. You could leave it out. If you want to keep it really simple, you could make your potting mix just with the cocoa coir, the perlite, and some slow release organic fertilizer. I am also going to add that at the end. That will be our final ingredient. But I do like to add the earthworm castings as well. An alternative to earthworm castings would be compost. The reason why I've chosen earthworm castings instead of compost is because my compost is all outside. I make my own compost out in the woods, and I also get a bulk delivery of compost. And both of those are outside and probably have insects or insect eggs and all kinds of creatures in there that I don't really want to bring into my house. So if you would prefer to get a bag of compost a bag of sterile compost that should be, I don't really want to say sterile because compost technically shouldn't be sterile. There's Milo again. But if you'd prefer to get bagged compost that's less likely to have insects in it, you could use that instead. I just like to get a bag of this and use this in my potting mix. So I'm going to use probably about half of this bag here. I usually use this whole bag. This is a 12-pound bag here, so this is the larger size. So I usually use about one of these bags to one of those blocks of coconut fiber. Since this bin that we have here only has about half of the cocoa coir in it, I'm going to save half of this to go with the other half that I'll mix up later in the season. So you can see that these worm castings are really black and rich. There's lots of nutrients and good soil life here. So this will really help This will really help just round out our potting mix. So let's go ahead and pour in about half of this bag. So here's our beautiful potting mix. So far, this looks really good. Just one more ingredient to add. So the final ingredient that we're going to add to this potting mix is some slow release organic fertilizer. So don't let the fact that I have this in a measuring cup fool you. I did not measure this, and I'm probably not adding all of this to the potting mix. I just use this as a scoop to carry it over, and I'm just going to mix in probably about half of this here. I think that looks good. We don't want to overdo the amount of nutrients in here because seedlings can be sensitive to too many nutrients. You know, they're basically baby plants and there's only so much that they can use. So we don't want to overdo it. So I think, I maybe put 2 cups or so in there. I think it was a little bit less than that. So I'm not really sure exactly how much I put in there. It was maybe a cup, maybe a cup and a half. Like I said, I didn't measure exactly. So we're gonna go ahead and just get this mixed up and see how our soil looks. Just gotta make sure to reach all the way down to the bottom here so everything gets evenly incorporated. That way I can see what our final mixture looks like and see if we need to add anything else. So I'm pretty happy with how this looks. I think it's a little light on perlite just because you can see that it just doesn't seem to have as much white in here as I would like. So the next time I am out in town, I am going to grab a little more perlite and add a little bit more perlite to this. But I hope that this does give you the idea of how easy it is to make your own potting mix. And like I said, I'm kind of doing this a little fancier than I have to. As I said, you could leave out the earthworm castings, you could leave out the vermiculite. If you wanted to make it really simple, just the basics would be cocoa coir, perlite, and a little bit of slow release organic fertilizer. So honestly, it's really easy. And I hope the fact that I didn't measure anything, please don't let that intimidate you, because I feel like if anything, that should show you that this is not necessarily an exact science, and you don't have to, gardening in general, you don't have to be perfect to get good results. So I find that very comforting, so I hope that it's comforting to you as well. So thank you so much for hanging out with me over the past few days as we made this potting soil together. Potting mix, I should call it, because we don't have any actual soil in this. So I hope that you are encouraged to start some seeds this year. I would love to hear if you make your own potting soil or potting mix. I would love to hear what ingredients you include. Is yours similar to mine? Do you add anything that I didn't add? Or if you like to purchase your own potting soil, to purchase pre-made potting soil, what brand do you like or what type do you like? I would love to hear recommendations for that too, and I'm sure many people in the comment section, they may not all prefer to make their own potting mix and may like to hear recommendations from experienced gardeners about what works really well. So go ahead and leave all that information in the comments below. I hope you're having a great day, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.